What really motivated me as a former biologist, that I felt that there was just a lack of real respect for experts. That is, people thought that, in a week or two of internet research, they knew better than people who have spent their lives, 30, 40 years studying whales, studying, plankton and ecosystem sciences, people who have studied energy policy and the way we're going to deal with climate change as a bigger issue. And then the sort of planning, the planning of how we're going to get ourselves out of this mess of climate change.
Is offshore wind killing the whales? Thankfully, you listen to this podcast, so you know the answer is no. But despite there not being even the smallest shred of evidence connecting whale deaths and offshore wind, and a universal agreement in the scientific community to the contrary, the lie continues. To this day, it is being repeated by anti-offshore wind advocates across the country who seem to utilize very similar, if not exactly the same talking points. Coincidence? We'll discuss. This is Plugging In. I'm Barry Wygel. Welcome to Plugging In, powering our way to a brighter and healthier New York. I'm your host, Barry Wygel. Each episode on this podcast, we will discuss a different topic related to clean energy, explaining complex topics in a way you can understand. Become part of the community as we help to make a brighter and healthier New York.
As the sun crests on the horizon, a new day dawns in our state. A new hope for tomorrow is rising, a clean future we create. Tomorrow we breathe easier, tomorrow the skies are clear. Today we are plugging in, the future of New York is here.
Joining us on this episode of the podcast is Timmons Roberts, a professor of environmental studies and sociology at Brown University and the executive director of the Climate Social Science Network. Also joining us is Isaac Slevin, the lead author of a report titled Against the Wind, a map of the anti-offshore wind network in the eastern United States. Isaac and Timmons, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Barry. Good to be on.
Thank you.
So I want to lay a little bit of groundwork before we kind of jump into this. One of you, please, provide a little bit of a summary of what this report found.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks for having us on. So in Against the Wind and our later peer-reviewed paper, which was called Beyond Dark Money, and came out late 2024, what we found is that the new anti-offshore wind movement has been receiving what we call information subsidies from dark money actors. What we mean when we say information subsidies is rhetorical arguments, legal support, capacity to fundraise, and just generally a whole suite of ways that the conservative movement and known dark money actors have made fighting against wind power easier. It's important for us to clarify here that the dark money framework that many people are accustomed to thinking through, especially with Jane Mayer's book, Dark Money, doesn't entirely apply here. And that's why we called the later piece, Beyond Dark Money, because we haven't identified a flow of money from these think tanks or other dark money actors to the grassroots anti-wind groups. And it would be unfair to claim as such. So that's why we're instead focusing on all sorts of observable material support that you can think of as an information subsidy or a capacity subsidy that, again, is flowing from known conservative, dark money, fossil fuel affiliated actors down to these grassroots organizations that are fighting against offshore wind on the East Coast.
For example, one of our key characters is David Stevenson from the Caesar Rodney Institute in Delaware. And he went and talked to anti-wind groups and told them you should attack the places where the cables come to shore. And that's because that's local jurisdiction, whereas this other stuff, the actual wind farms are out in federal waters. So to me, that's just an example of a very strategic piece of information. And they also, of course, started the whole rhetoric about whales being killed off by offshore wind. So this is not just locally groups discovering that argument by themselves. It's really been something they have been coached to do.
Do you have insight as to why they chose offshore wind particularly, or is this happening in other fights like onshore wind and solar?
Well, I can just say that it is happening. Onshore wind is being attacked. Solar, especially commercial scale installations, are being attacked in quite similar ways and many of the same arguments and the same networks. And again, it's a lot of the same issues of local groups being freaked out, frankly, by information that they're receiving, mostly online, often through social media, about the negative environmental and other impacts of renewable energy. So it's become really a national problem, international. We have cases in Europe and Australia we're hearing about, even in Brazil and so on. So this is happening a lot of places and really adds up to a serious problem for our ability to act on climate change.
And when you look at an issue like the whale issue, that's something that's been debunked from the beginning. And when you first hear about offshore wind, that's a valid question. How will this impact marine life and whales? And so there's an answer out there, and we've talked about it on this podcast. But yet, we still hear it from now the highest levels of government about this whale issue. Is the link and the information flow that you found, is that really helping to keep these false narratives alive?
Yeah, it absolutely is. And one of the ways we knew that we found something is that notoriously anti-climate, pro-deregulation organizations such as the Heartland Institute suddenly got really interested in protecting whales and started announcing or threatening lawsuits in the name of whales, participating in events in the name of whales. And so yeah, there's a lot of different ways that information makes its way through the ecosystem. Some of them absolutely are pro-whale, unscientific claims made by groups like the Heartland Institute and CFACT, which is the Committee for a Constructive Tomorrow. Sometimes, though, and this is important to note as well, just the narrative takes on its own life. And so if you're in some of these Facebook groups that anti-offshore wind people communicate in, you'll see a story that simply notes that a whale was found washed up on a coastal area. And the story doesn't make any claims, but the people reading the story do. And so the comments of that article, the comments of that Facebook post are then associating the whale death with offshore wind. And that's not true. So, and this is where, again, I think the information subsidy framework has been helpful because it's important to think about how narratives take on new life, especially in a low trust environment, low trust in science, low trust in the federal government as a regulator. So yeah, to summarize that, sometimes it is direct from anti-climate, pro-fossil fuel groups, and sometimes the narrative is just embedded and reinforced as such.
Since this report's come out, what kind of reaction have you gotten? I know we've seen these groups can be, almost militant in their work. Has that trickled down to you? Have you seen any of that?
First of all, a lot of the response has been extremely positive. We've had local people, farmers even saying that they've seen the same thing in their, communities on wind and solar. We've had, even fishing people say, yeah, I've heard a lot of these arguments and I've, just can't believe it when, I believe the science that is showing that it's ship strikes and entanglement in fishing gear that's causing these problems with whale deaths that are really rising. And reporters, environmental groups, wind developers, and on, politicians, policymakers have found this report. It's traveled far more than I ever expected. And people keep coming back to it as a useful resource to sort of map these relationships between the different groups. We have been attacked, on the other hand. We've been attacked on social media, for example, claiming that we are funded by the wind industry and that we're shills for them. We have never taken a dime from the wind industry or any energy company. And there's been a few threatened lawsuits, and I'm not worried about it. We stand by our work, and we've been, all these threats and claims have been dropped just quietly. So they're unsubstantiated. What's the word? Sort of frivolous claims.
So what do we do with this information as climate activists when we talk to those people, that elected officials and those people that are involved in this that come up against these groups or are being lobbied by these groups. How should people deal with those types of groups?
Yeah, it's a really good question. The first thing is, as a researcher, I'll say that things that aren't true just aren't true. So don't acquiesce to things that aren't true. But it's really important to note that while a lot of the surface level claims, the things that we see in public, aren't true, there are really real concerns that people are responding to. We also know that a lot of these communities are organizing themselves. It's not just telling mistruths on purpose or an accident on Facebook. It's going to someone's house and watching a presentation about how offshore wind is going to irreparably damage your community, going to a forum and hearing that from the same, going on social media and hearing a story not just from a hack brought in by the fossil fuel industry, but someone who represents your community or a community you care about. The anti-offshore wind people are organizing. They are really organizing. And so you have to meet people with their underlying concerns. You have to open up conversations with them.
I strongly agree that the concerns need to be acknowledged. And I would go on to say that one should, though, also point out where the information is coming from, and especially when it's disinformation. And I think there's been a real hesitation to do that by some of the actors in this situation, and it's been unfortunate, I think, because it's not been a very fair fight in some ways. That, you know, one group has really taken the gloves off and went for a sort of a post-truth world in some ways, with many claims that are just not based in fact. And so refute the disinformation directly, and also point to where it's coming from. We've built a whole website called realoffshorewind.org, and that was designed to choose a few of the most common arguments and refute them by scientists here in Rhode Island, at University of Rhode Island and at Brown University.
So let's talk about another stakeholder group, and that being journalists. So journalists are trained to try to tell both sides of a story. So if the wind industry calls them, tells them about this great project, tells them about the benefits, okay, I got to balance that out. Let's go find an opposition group. I Google it, and one of these groups that you've documented comes up. How do advocates educate the journalists, either proactively or reactively, about your work and the connections you've found?
I would say this is why we wrote this report, really, is to help people understand these connections and the peer-reviewed journal article. So we hope this can help journalists see how the person that they're talking to may be part of a much bigger network and receiving this information through that network.
Journalists and advocates began reaching out to us in a seemingly sympathetic manner, saying that they knew it was dark money all the time, and they were thankful that there was research showing these funding connections, but there weren't funding connections. So you don't have to take any specific claim at face value, because there's a wide body of research saying, offshore wind does not kill whales. Offshore wind does not emit secret high-pitched noises that's bad for human health. And I trust that any fact-checking journalist would not repeat those claims. But don't portray organizations as funded by out-of-state actors if that's not something that's provable. And I just think that this is a hard question, because there isn't yet the language in the general milieu to look beyond dark money and at other forms of coalitions and other forms of sharing support. And it's a tricky framing, but I do think that that's the new frontier, and that's how you balance what we are seeing of coordinated support for grassroots anti-wind groups, and also understanding that there are real reasons why people are frustrated and preoccupied with offshore wind.
And I hope a message of this podcast is that it's okay to ask questions, and especially with renewable energy projects, it's okay to ask stupid questions about these types of things, but you need to accept the truth, which is sometimes where we have issues. So, in a healthy democracy, we have these debates. A project's proposed, there's people against it, there's people for it. They have a debate. Hopefully they come to the answer that's for the betterment of society. Obviously a very rosy view of how the country works. But do you think the connections that you've found and the right-wing think tanks are doing a disservice to democracy, or is that overstating it too much?
I don't think that's overstating it. We're almost in a post-truth world, but I have to say that what really motivated me as a former biologist, that I felt that there was just a lack of real respect for experts. That is, people thought that, in a week or two of internet research, they knew better than people who have spent their lives, 30, 40 years studying whales, studying, plankton and ecosystem sciences, people who have studied energy policy and the way we're going to deal with climate change as a bigger issue. And then the sort of planning, the planning of how we're going to get ourselves out of this mess of climate change. And so, there had been for 15 years efforts to plan the offshore development of wind in Rhode Island. And we had something called the Ocean SAMP, the Ocean Special Area Management Plan. And it brought together stakeholders, starting 15 years ago. And the problem is that it took quite a while. There was a delay during the first Trump administration as well in deploying the wind arrays. And so there was sort of a new group of people. Some of these people even had moved to the coast since, all that planning was done, all those stakeholder outreach had been done. And so they thought they knew better than other people. And I guess that's, as Isaac's been saying, a lack of trust in the system. There has to be a certain level of trust. But clearly there needs to be a lot of engagement of local people right through the process, all the way to the last day, or even after the thing is spinning out there, because we've seen some people are going to be even coming after it after it's already installed.
There's all kinds of peer-reviewed social science research on the need for trust in these kinds of stakeholder relationships. A lot of it we cite in the Beyond Dark Money report. Developers need to be honest, including when things go wrong. So it's tricky, right? Because you don't want to have stakeholder engagement to the point that nothing gets done anywhere and you aren't able to stop the climate crisis. I mean, going back to your previous question of how do you confront misinformation about whales? I mean, look at what climate change is doing to the Gulf of Maine, right? But at the same time, good faith interactions are really, really important. And we can only control what we can control. So starting with activists and researchers entering these conversations in good faith with questions and looking to build, if not consensus, then at least towards some common truths, to me sounds like a really important place to start.
So my takeaway from all of this is that the truth tellers should not give up, that there's a lot of work to do and we should keep at it. I hope you agree.
Absolutely.
Definitely.
So yeah, that covers it. And we'll certainly have a link to the full report in the show notes, so if people are interested in learning more. But yeah, Timmons, Isaac, thank you so much for joining us today.
Pleasure, Barry. Good luck with it.
Thank you, Barry. Take care.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Plugging In. I hope you learned something, and I hope you share this knowledge with someone else. It would be incredibly helpful if you leave us a 5-star review wherever you found this podcast. If there's a topic you would like us to cover in the future, or have a question about clean energy, send us an email at podcast@aceny.org. You can follow us on social media using the links in the show notes, or consider joining our Clean Energy Supporters mailing list at aceny.org/support. Your support is crucial to creating a brighter and healthier New York. I'll see you next time.
As the sun crests on the horizon, a new day dawns in our state. A new hope for tomorrow is rising, a clean future we create. Tomorrow we breathe easier, tomorrow the skies are clear. Today we are plugging in